There are a number of citizen initiatives that you'll find on your November ballot. We turn to two that should be there, barring legal challenges. They focus on medical marijuana. One issue is an amendment to the Arkansas Constitution led by Attorney David Couch. It would legalize physician-certified medical marijuana, set up for-profit dispensaries, and give the state regulatory authority to tax and oversee the system. In our latest poll, 49% say they support the Arkansas medical marijuana amendment, while 43% say they would vote against it. Just 8% are undecided. Another proposal is an initiated act led by Arkansans for Compassionate Care. It would also provide for physician-certified medical marijuana and set up some systems for distribution. It would allow a hardship certificate for those who live remotely to grow up to 10 cannabis plants for medicinal purposes. Voters saying that they were for the Medical Cannabis Act, 36%. 53% say they oppose it, and 11% are undecided. So, two similar but different proposals, two very different results. Another word from our sponsors, and I'm back with Dr. Jay Barth for another round of analysis on this very subject. We're back after this. Joining me again is Dr. Jay Barth, Professor of Political Science at Hendrix College. All right, we've run through those medical marijuana numbers, Jay. Clearly, voters have two different positions on the two measures. What do you kind of see as why there is this difference in terms of interpretation of the concept of approving medical marijuana?
Yeah, you know, our period of polling has been a period where there's been a lot of debate in Arkansas over this issue of medical marijuana. And what we've seen is that the broad concept, you know, should there be medical marijuana available to patients? Lots of support for it. When you get to the specific proposals, it gets more complicated. And in particular, what we saw in 2012, when it came very close to passing in the state, we did some follow-up polling, and there were some indications that the provision in that proposal, which allowed individuals who were in rural areas away from dispensaries to grow their own, was really troubling to Arkansas voters and might have made the difference in that. So what we've seen now in 4 years later are two different proposals, one of which looks a whole lot like that 2012 proposal, another one which has a more limited number of dispensaries, more regulation, and does not have the grow your own provision. And that's where we do start to see the gap here, is that more limited constitutional amendment seems to be polling well. It looks a lot like in the polling like we saw in 2012.
Right. People may have been a little more honest with us this time
around.
Right.
That may be, yeah, because I think there's been some mainstreaming of that issue. But the grow your own, the provision, the initiative that has the grow your own provision, that seems to indicate some concern. So I think if you had to bet, if either of them is going to pass, it appears to be the amendment. The question is how much confusion in voters results from the two proposals being right there on the ballot together when they get there. And we know that voters sometimes, under the stress of voting, because they've got a short clock, they feel a little pressure if there's a line. What do they do? Do they show that nuance in their voting? A lot will depend on the education that both sides give over the next few weeks.
And of course, there's still legal challenges out there too, so it's no guarantee they'll still be on the ballot, but for today, they are on the ballot. So, all right, in the crosstabs, what do you see just when you look across, whether it's gender, whether it's age, whether it's political affiliation, what do the crosstabs kind of tell you about these two proposals?
Yeah, so the patterns are very similar. They just are lower on the initiative than they are on the amendment, but younger voters, and it really is a straight line from younger voters, very supportive, older voters, more disapproving. We see African American voters more approving of both measures. We see Democrats more approving of most measures. Independents actually fairly positive on both as well. They're pretty split, as you might expect, but more positive than Republicans are. We do see a gender split. Women more supportive of the amendment, a little less supportive of the Grow Your Own initiative. So that's the one area where we do start to see a little bit of deviation. They're both very popular across the state. Maybe a little more support in Northwest Arkansas, Arkansas, and that's actually where we saw some good support for this in 2012.
It's probably where we got some Newton County votes in there. So
Indeed. And
Carroll County
yeah,
too. So.
And some upscale voters who actually see this as,
Yeah.
as an appropriate step.
All right, so we have done a lot of polling on this subject before. We did for a town hall for KATV maybe about a year ago. We did an entire poll on medical marijuana. We saw some very widespread support for the concept. I think it was around 81% or something phenomenal like that. But clearly, once you get into the details, as you mentioned earlier, it brings those numbers significantly down. Will voters pay that much attention to it, do you think? Or how does that messaging need to work?
Yeah, I think the one thing that indicates that maybe they will is that the percentage of don't knows on both these questions is actually pretty low, especially compared to the other ballot measure we looked at, which had really high unknowns. I think voters have thought a lot about this issue. Now, we've got 6 or 7 weeks where a lot's going to be told in terms of what the communication looks like. But I think there is because it's an issue that's been around for a while. Voters have thought about it a bunch, and they kind of know what they want, and what they don't want in a medical marijuana. I think in an ideal world, they would probably prefer that the legislature did it rather than it being done at the ballot box. But I think there is going to be some separation on these.
It's post Labor Day. It's time for these ballot initiatives to start spending some money on TV and radio. All right, I want to go back to something we talked to a little bit in the first block where we visited. Looking again at the growth in Republicanism that we saw in terms of party identification, could this be could this be an election cycle where it's just almost a wave election like we saw in 2014 where just Republicans up and down the ballot won everything because of the overwhelming Republicanism in the state that we saw? I mean, constitutional offices, congressional races that should have been much more competitive were not. Could we see some down ballot stuff, legislature, local races, really just go wholesale R in this election cycle?
I think the challenge for Republicans there's just not a lot of races on the ballot down below compared to 2014 and 2012.
Not for the Democrats either.
Yeah. I mean, on either side. I mean, there may be a wave, but if there are no boats there to be drawn along, it may not have much of an impact. We do have some parts of the state where Democrats are going to win those elections no matter what. I mean, urban areas,
the Delta,
Fayetteville. Right. I mean, the Delta, et cetera, heavily African American areas. So that part's not changing. We do have maybe about a dozen races that I think are competitive. I think we'll watch those and see if the trend continues. I think the local races, especially out in some of those rural counties, if we're going to see some shifts, that's probably where it's going to be.
All right, he's Dr. Jay Barth with Hendrix College. As always, great insight. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.